I'd like to start by asking you about the question of talent management. In the last year or so, there's been an enormous amount of focus on talent management, particularly in the Asian region. Why do you think that is, and what are the key challenges that you encounter in this arena?
I think, I don't think it's, of course there's a huge amount of focus on it, but it's been going around for a long time. I mean, shared services by their nature rely on people to interact with processes and make them work better. And I think if you look at the demographic, typically, of people that work within the shared service environment, it's not unusual to have quite a young population of people. They have aspirations, they're usually very highly qualified, they have degrees, they are not just multilingual, not just bilingual, they're usually multilingual. And retaining and holding on to them for a certain period of time is an absolute key challenge, because they're not going to stay around forever. So it's the best thing is about what can they get from you as an employer and what you can provide them, and then what you get in return as an employer. So it's almost like you have to create this kind of social contract. And it's constantly I'm talking to people about the value of what they're doing and the relevance to that to their career development, as opposed to just simply coming in and bashing a load of invoices for months on end. So it's making them understand what you're trying to do, but at the same time getting them to understand the value of what this can mean in terms of their own career development, for example.
Sorry. So many people have this preconception that the SSO industry is one that is process-driven, monotonous kind of work. First, do you agree with this? And if you don't, how do you dispute
No, I
this?
absolutely and utterly disagree with that. In fact, possibly the misconceptions are probably coming from people outside of shared services, or if they are working in shared services, they shouldn't be. I always use the analogy of Amazon.com. Okay, because the product is books, CDs, that sort of stuff. It's not a very sexy product, but the process behind it is very sexy. And there's an incredible amount of thought and insight has gone into that to create such a process that engages with people. So I think the key challenge for anybody is, there's two sides to it actually. We all know a well-designed process can work effectively if people can engage with it. So the design principles in the process, people have to really think from a behavioral perspective, how can I get people to do the things I want them to do and not do the things that I don't want them to do? So how do I get them to make it easy for them? Because that's the best way of actually getting people to engage with the process. So if I'm trying to invent something like that and design something like that, that should be chief in my consideration. So that goes beyond the normal just processing type of work. The other part of this as well is once I've designed my process, is how do I get people to actually use it the way I want them to use it? And again, there's a huge amount of behavioral aspects behind that. I think a lot of people get excited by it. Maybe some people don't, but I think if people see how this could potentially operate, I think they get excited about it.
Now, you touched on this a little bit when you talk about Amazon, and what I'm talking about is the talk about customers. This year, I think more than ever, there's a lot of talk about customers. Why do you think that is, and how do you think companies can give the customers the support that they need?
I think it's always been about customers, ultimately. I think there has been misconceptions, maybe with people who are starting out shared services or people who are a little bit old-fashioned at this, to say this is about a process. You don't get support unless you get grassroots level support from people in your organization that you're doing a good job. They're not going to support you. There's always going to be this misperception, or at least, managing the perception gap between the reality and the perception, if you see my point, is a very, very important aspect. So that requires actually engaging with people and talking to people and talking to customers about, I'm doing this today. I'm 99.999% correct and error-free. What do you think of my service? And if you get the answer back and says, well, I think you're not very good, then that has to be addressed. So then this is the perception issue. It's a behavioural thing. So I don't think there's ever been a lack of customer respect. I think what you might see what's happening is that people are really understanding that if I want to be successful in what I'm doing here, it's not just about the process and about keeping error rates down and Six Sigma and all this sort of stuff. It's very much about how am I perceived and what is the perception equaling the reality, I think is the point here.
Right. Now, I'd like to step back a little while and look at the macro view about this. Chazey Partners has been working with many different organizations. Which do you think is the biggest growth market in the shared services sector?
That's a very interesting one, because I think there has been, what we certainly do see is growth in what I call multifunctional shared services. I think that's a huge growth area. I think companies that have successfully, say, done it in finance or HR are starting to see the benefit actually joining those organizations together and bringing them under one governance structure or one umbrella. And I think to some respect people talk in terms of global business services. So giving a joined up consistent service across the piece, almost like a one-stop shop with a singular view of what the customer experience should look like, I think is an area. That's not necessarily a growth thing, it's a development thing, if you see my point. In terms of growth of scope, there really is, I was talking to someone yesterday from Coca-Cola who said to me, their mantra internally within the Coca-Cola company is that if it's not about selling the product, then it's a candidate for shared services, as far as they're concerned. So that pretty much sets the line. You can go as far as you want. I think there's a lot of places that haven't been explored yet, but you know, people talk in terms of data analytics and big data and whatever, but that's been going on for years as well.
Right.
It just hasn't had that name about it. You know, another classic example is that for many years organizations have been a simple T&E process, travel and expense process. People have been running these for years, but what they're seeing now is that they're looking at employee behavior, for example. They're looking at who they're buying from, you know, where they're spending their money on airlines and on hotels and so forth. And so the smart analytics there is helping organizations to be smarter in terms of how they book flights, for example, how they book hotels, which hotels they use, and so forth and so forth. So I don't think there's a huge limitation on this. I think it's really a case of where an organization thinks shared services can support it. If it has a very good experience of it and proof of concept has worked very well, I think the doors are wide open. Which I think, by the way, is connected to that whole perception versus reality thing, because if you can manage that perception and manage it well, where people think you're doing a great job, then the doors will open. And I think if you were to ask me one specific area, I don't think there really is an area. I think it's a case of the world is your oyster, so to speak. You know.
Right. No, I think related to that as well as having an operational structure that is agile. In your opinion, how do you think companies can develop an agile organization that can support their end goal, which is basically giving their customers the best experience that they could possibly have?
Well, that's an interesting one, and I think one of the things, believe it or not, is this whole question about insourcing and outsourcing.
Yes.
And you know, certainly in my experience, you know, I'm an absolute firm believer in what I would call selective outsourcing, not necessarily wholesale outsourcing. And the reason for that is, you know, if you're a shared service organization doing something today, the chances are the dynamic is going to change within the next 2 to 3 years anyway. And so you have to be flexible enough to be able to adapt to that change. And if you're too much gone into an outsourcing third-party relationship, I think you're going to find that transition or that adapting more difficult to do. But if you have a combination of both and running a hybrid organization, I think you're probably in the best position to do that. I think though, how can I say in terms of adapting? I tell you, one area that always excites me and to see it happening is there are many acquisitive companies around the place, and when they have successfully implemented shared services in their own organization and they make an acquisition, and I just know it's almost undisputed with many companies who are doing shared services and are acquiring companies, that the integration of the newly acquired company is usually a hell of a lot smoother and more successful than if they weren't doing it. So they have an idea of how they want to run the operation, not just in turn, you know, they have an idea that they can bring this organization in and that they can get it working in the way it wants to work, and you know, at a particularly fast pace.
So maybe for my final question, how do you foresee the shared services sector developing in the next, say, 2 to 3 years?
I think what you're going to see is certainly the process excellence side will continue. I think definitely, I think new geographies are definitely coming up. I think one of the big debates is going to be this whole commoditization versus specialization thing. Many of the things that are done in shared services are a commodity. And commodities, like we all know from, you know, we buy telecom providers, we have mobile phones, we use banking and so forth. And to a great degree, we become price sensitive, for example. And, you know, for shared services really to show its true value, it's got to move away from the commoditization and getting into areas that are genuinely, you know, an organization can turn around and say, you know, I never thought of that, or without shared services we wouldn't have been able to do that. And so to keep on developing niche areas, but being careful, by the way, of not relying too much on things like that are not conducive to shared services. Shared services is supposed to be on scale, so that has to be borne in mind. It's based around a capability that's excellence in the process, but has to be careful that it doesn't get too much into the kind of local knowledge things, because that can be a limiting factor. So there's various different things going on there, and I think it's a very healthy future.